Picture this. A man leans over a map by lamplight, and with a slow, unhurried finger he begins handing out cities that are not yet his. This town to that lord. This river valley to that commander. A whole capital promised to a favourite before a single wall of it has fallen. He's not gambling, he's not hoping. He's dividing a living country the way a butcher divides a carcass, because in his mind the killing is already done. Around him the camp goes on as camps do. Somewhere a horse is being fed. Somewhere flatbread is cooking on a hot stone, and the smell of it drifts between the tents. Men sharpen blades they expect to use only for mopping up. Everything about this night feels routine, settled, almost bored, and that is exactly what makes it monstrous. His name is Devlet the First Giray, Khan of Crimea, and he has good reason to feel certain, because 1 year earlier he did the impossible. He rode north with the horsemen of the steppe, slipped past the river defences and set fire to Moscow itself. The wooden city burned so completely that chroniclers struggled to count the dead. He rode home with captives, with plunder, and with a new title whispered in fear, the one who took the throne. Now he has come back to finish it, to erase the Tsardom of Russia from the map and carry its Tsar away in chains. We are told this is the age of Ivan the Terrible, the towering, all-powerful Russian Tsar, the man who crushed Kazan and Astrakhan, the ruler whose very name means dread. That is the story most people know, but the truth of the summer of 1572 is stranger and darker than the legend. In that summer, the terrible Tsar was not the hunter, he was the hunted, and the survival of Russia itself would not rest on him at all. It would rest on a wooden fort on wheels, on roughly 20,000 exhausted men, and on a prince whose reward for saving the nation would be a traitor's death. Quick thing before we go deeper, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, and if you're new here, subscribe now, because what happened next at Molodi is a story the chronicles barely dared to record, and you won't want to look away. To understand how 20,000 men could shatter a horde many times their size, you first have to understand just how close Russia was to the edge. This was not a proud empire at its height. This was a bleeding, half-broken state that had spent a decade tearing itself apart from the inside. The Tsar's own policies had emptied the treasury, thinned the army and turned neighbour against neighbour. Plague stalked the towns, famine followed. And to the south, across the open grass, the horsemen watched and waited for weakness. By 1572, that weakness was no longer a secret. It was an invitation, and Devlet the First Giray intended to accept it in full, not for another raid, not for another ransom, but for conquest. He would not simply burn Moscow again. He would keep it. So he divided the map. He assigned the provinces. He named the governors. He treated a nation of millions as a prize already won. And in that arrogance lay the first crack in his plan. Because a man who believes the fight is over stops fighting carefully. He stops looking for the trap, and there was a trap being built, not of stone, not of iron, but of timber, powder, and desperate, calculated patience. To see how it was made, we have to leave the Khan's confident tent and travel back into the ruin of the country he thought he had already conquered. To understand Molodi, you first have to understand a Russia that was barely holding together. For most of his reign, Ivan IV had been a builder as much as a destroyer. In his early years, he reformed the law, reorganized the army, and led the campaigns that swallowed the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, pushing Russian power down the Volga toward the Caspian Sea. For a moment, the young Tsar looked like the architect of a rising empire. Then something in him turned, and the same energy that had built the state began to consume it. The turning point had a name, the Oprichnina. It was, in simple terms, a state within the state. A private domain answering only to the Tsar, patrolled by a black-clad corps of men loyal to him alone. What began as a tool against suspected traitors became a machine of terror. Nobles were stripped of their lands, entire families vanished, whole towns were punished for imagined disloyalty. The most infamous blow fell on the great city of Novgorod, which was subjected to weeks of brutal repression on the mere suspicion of treason. The details are grim, and we will not linger on them, but the result is what matters here. The Russian elite was gutted, and the men who should have been leading armies were instead watching their backs. Now stack disaster upon disaster. In the north and west, the Tsar was locked in the long grinding Livonian War, a struggle to reach the Baltic Sea that pulled Russian soldiers and money toward the opposite end of the country. Every regiment sent west was a regiment not guarding the south. On top of the war came plague, sweeping through the towns and killing without regard for rank. On top of the plague came famine, as fields went untended and trade collapsed. By the early 1570s, the Tsardom of Russia was a giant with hollow bones. On the map it looked enormous. In reality it was overstretched, underfed and dangerously thin along its most vulnerable border, the open southern frontier, where the forest gave way to the endless grassland of the steppe. That frontier had no natural wall. There were rivers, yes, the Great Oka above all, and there were scattered fortified towns and watchtowers. But between them lay hundreds of kilometres of open country, and across that country, every year, came raiders. For generations, the horsemen of the Crimean Khanate had ridden north to burn villages and, above all, to take people. The slave trade was the lifeblood of that economy, and Russian and Ukrainian captives were its currency. A bad year on the frontier meant thousands of families dragged south in chains, sold in the markets of the Black Sea coast. The Russians had built a system to slow this bleeding. They called it the Beregovaya Slushba, the riverbank service. Each spring, as the grass grew tall enough to feed the steppe ponies, Russian regiments would march to the line of the Oka and take up positions along the fords, watching for the dust cloud that meant a horde was coming. It was a defensive posture, a shield held up year after year against a blade that never stopped falling. But a shield only works if the arm behind it is strong, and by 1572 that arm was shaking. The Tsar's terror had thinned the officer corps. The war in the west had drained the ranks, the treasury was empty, the harvest had failed, and the memory of the previous summer hung over everything like smoke that would not clear. Because the previous summer, the shield had failed completely. The horsemen had not been stopped at the river. They had ridden all the way to Moscow, and they had burned it. To understand the terror that gripped Russia in 1572, we have to go back 1 year to the day the sky over the capital turned black. The man who did it was not a barbarian stumbling out of the wilderness. He was a shrewd, patient and utterly determined ruler, and his name deserves to be understood because he was the equal of any king in Europe at reading weakness. Devlet I Giray was the Khan of Crimea, master of a state that sat at the crossroads of two worlds. To the north lay the grasslands and the Russian frontier. To the south, across the Black Sea, lay the greatest power of the age, the Ottoman Empire, ruled from Constantinople by the Sultan. The Crimean Khanate was, in theory, a vassal of that empire, and its khans drew both prestige and danger from that bond. When the Sultan smiled on Crimea, the Khan could call on Ottoman firepower, cannon, and the elite infantry known as the janissaries. When the Sultan's interests aligned with the Khan's ambitions, the steppe and the empire moved together. Devlet's people were the heirs of a long and formidable history. Their ancestors had ridden with the great Mongol conquerors, the hordes that had once shattered the Russian principalities and held them in submission for centuries. That memory ran deep on both sides. To the Russians, the horsemen from the south were the shadow of an old and terrible domination. To the Crimeans, Moscow was an upstart, a former tributary that had grown fat and forgetful of its place. For years, Devlet had raided Russia's southern lands, testing the defences, taking captives, probing for the moment of maximum weakness. And in the spring of 1571 he found it. With the Russian army scattered, much of it far away on the western front, the rest strung thin along the riverbank, Devlet gathered a large host and struck north with astonishing speed. Guided, the sources say, by men who knew the secret fords, his horsemen slipped across the Oka where the Russians least expected them, and swung around the defending regiments entirely. Suddenly, there was nothing between the horde and the capital. Moscow in those days was a city of wood. Its houses, its walls, its churches, timber upon timber, packed close, dried by summer heat. When the raiders reached the outskirts and set their fires, the flames did not merely burn buildings. They devoured the city. A wind rose. The fire leapt from street to street faster than anyone could flee. In a matter of hours, one of the great cities of the north was reduced to ash and smoke. The human cost was catastrophic, beyond any reliable count, and we will leave the horror of it to the imagination rather than the eye. Devlet did not even need to storm the fortress at the city's heart. The fire did his work. He withdrew south laden with captives and plunder, and he carried home a new and chilling honorific, a title meaning, roughly, the taker of the throne. He had not just raided Russia, he had humiliated it, and he was not finished. From his position of triumph, Devlet sent demands to the Tsar. He wanted the return of Kazan and Astrakhan, the very Khanates Ivan had conquered years before. He wanted tribute. He wanted Russia to bend the knee and become, once more, a servant of the steppe. For a moment, the terrible Tsar of Russia negotiated from a position of genuine fear. Some accounts suggest he was even willing to discuss giving up Astrakhan to buy peace. But Devlet smelled total victory, and total victory does not compromise. He rejected the half measures. He wanted everything. So through the winter and spring of 1572, the Khan gathered a far greater host than before. This time he was not coming to burn and leave. He was coming to stay, and this time, waiting for him on the riverbank was a man who had spent the whole terrible year preparing for exactly this. His name was Mikhail Ivanovich Vorotynsky, and he was, in many ways, an unlikely saviour. Vorotynsky was a prince of old blood, a member of the high aristocracy that Ivan's terror had spent years destroying. He himself had felt the Tsar's suspicion. Not long before, he had been arrested and sent into disgrace and exile, his loyalty questioned, his life at the mercy of a ruler's mood. That he was now standing at the head of Russia's southern defence tells you two things at once: how deep the crisis had become, and how badly the shattered state needed the few competent commanders it had left. In a kingdom that had devoured its own nobility, experience like Vorotynsky's had become too precious to waste, even for a Tsar who trusted no one. Vorotynsky was given command of the riverbank forces, the regiments tasked with holding the Oka line against the coming storm, and he understood, better than most, just how impossible that task looked on paper. The horde bearing down on him was vast. His own forces were a patchwork: the border regiments, contingents of the Oprichnina and the Older Land Army finally fighting side by side, Cossacks from the frontier, and hired soldiers from the German lands who brought with them the disciplined use of firearms. All told, perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 men. Against them, by the higher estimates, marched a host of many tens of thousands, swollen by allied Nogais horsemen from the eastern steppe, and stiffened by Ottoman janissaries and artillery. Some chroniclers put the invading total as high as 120,000. Modern historians argue the real number was likely lower, but even the cautious estimates leave the Russians outnumbered several times over. No general could win that fight in the open. On the flat grassland, the mobility of the steppe cavalry was overwhelming. A Russian army that tried to stand in a line would be surrounded, outflanked, and cut apart by horse archers who could strike and wheel away faster than heavy troops could respond. Vorotynsky knew this, so he did not plan to fight in the open at all. He planned to make the enemy come to him, to a wall. And here we meet the strange, brilliant weapon at the heart of this story, the gulyay-gorod. The name means, roughly, the walking town, or the wandering fortress. It was exactly what it sounds like. Thick wooden shields, heavy planks reinforced and pierced with slots, were mounted on wheels or on sledges so that they could be hauled by horses across the countryside and then locked together into a wall. Behind that wall, soldiers could fire cannon and arquebuses through the gaps, while remaining shielded from arrows and lances. Think about what this meant. It was a castle you could move, a fortress that could march to the battlefield, assemble in hours and turn any patch of open ground into a killing position. For an army that could not match the steppe in a cavalry duel, it was the perfect answer, a way to force the light, fast, lightly armoured horsemen to do the one thing they hated most: charge over and over into fixed fortifications bristling with gunpowder. But a fortress, even a walking one, is only as good as the ground it stands on and the plan behind it. A wall in the wrong place is just a target. Vorotynsky's genius was not the machine itself. It was knowing exactly where to put it, exactly when to reveal it, and exactly how to bait an overconfident enemy into breaking his own army against it. For that, he needed the Khan to make a mistake, and to make him make it, Vorotynsky had a young, aggressive commander who was about to do something that looked, at first, almost suicidal. In late July of 1572, the dust cloud came. Devlet I Giray brought his host to the Oka, the broad river that formed Russia's last real barrier before Moscow. He did not intend to batter his way through the strongest Russian positions. He intended to do what had worked so devastatingly the year before, to slip across at a lightly guarded point and race for the capital before the defenders could react. Speed had burned Moscow once. Speed would do it again, and at first it seemed to work. The Khan's forces forced a crossing at a stretch of the river that the Russians could not hold in strength. A relatively small Russian detachment guarding one of the fords was brushed aside by the sheer weight of numbers. The great host began pouring over the water and onto the northern bank, turning toward Moscow. The road to the capital lay open, just as it had in 1571. For the Russian command, this was the nightmare scenario made real. The enemy was across the river, the shield had been bypassed. If nothing changed, the horde would be at the walls of a city still scarred from the last burning, and there would be little left to stop it. But Vorotynsky had not staked everything on holding the river. He had planned for the possibility that the enemy would break through, and he had built his real trap for what came next. The first move was a gamble that bordered on reckless. As the rear of the invading army streamed across the Oka, a Russian commander named Dmitry Kvorostinin struck. Kvorostinin was young, bold, and hungry for a fight, the kind of officer who saw an opening where others saw only danger. With a mobile force, he fell upon the tail of the horde as it crossed, hitting the rear guard hard and throwing it into confusion. On its own, this was a pinprick against a giant. A few thousand men could not hope to destroy a host of tens of thousands. But that was never the point. The point was to enrage the giant, to make him turn around, and it worked. The rear guard that Kvorostinin mauled was no minor detachment. It included men close to the Khan himself, and the blow was sharp enough that Devlet could not simply ignore it and press on to Moscow with an unbeaten Russian force snapping at his heels. To leave an intact enemy army behind him, astride his line of retreat and supply, was to invite disaster. A commander marching on a capital does not want a hostile army loose at his back. So Devlet made the decision that would doom him. He turned the head of his host around. Instead of racing for the undefended prize of Moscow, he wheeled to crush the impudent Russian force that had dared to strike him. The force under Kvorostinin, and behind it, the main army under Vorotynsky. This is the hinge of the entire story. In that single choice, the initiative quietly changed hands. Moments before, Devlet had been the aggressor, dictating the campaign, choosing where and when to strike. Now, without fully realizing it, he had allowed the Russians to choose the battlefield. Kvorostinin, pursued by the furious vanguard of the horde, did not simply flee at random. He fell back in a deliberate fighting retreat, drawing the enemy after him like a fisherman playing a hooked and thrashing fish. He was leading them straight toward a low rise near a village called Molodi, and toward the walking fortress that had already been hauled into position, and locked together on the high ground, waiting in silence for the horde to arrive. Molodi lay perhaps 50 to 60 kilometers south of Moscow, close to a small river, in the kind of gently rolling country that offered exactly what Vorotynsky needed: a hill. On that hill, the gulyay-gorod stood assembled. Its wooden shields were locked together into a ring or a wall, positioned so that any force attacking it would have to climb toward it across open ground, into the muzzles of the guns. Inside and around it waited the core of the Russian army: the gunners, the arquebuses, the German mercenaries with their firearms, the cannon that had been dragged all this way for a single purpose. In the low ground and along a nearby stream, more Russian troops took up supporting positions, ready to make any approach to the fort a gauntlet. When Kvorostinin came galloping back with the enemy vanguard hard on his heels, he did the thing that turned a retreat into a trap. At the last moment, he peeled his men aside, and the pursuing horsemen, carried forward by their own momentum and their hunger to catch him, suddenly found themselves not facing a fleeing enemy, but a wall of timber and gunpowder. The first crash of the guns tore into them. Massed volleys, fired from behind cover into tightly packed cavalry at close range, did terrible work. The steppe horsemen, so deadly in the open where they could circle and shoot and never be pinned, were now doing the one thing that stripped away all their advantages: charging a fixed fortification head-on. Their arrows could be loosed at the wall, but the men behind it were shielded. Their lances and swords meant nothing against thick planks. All they could do was ride into the fire and die, or wheel away and try again. And Devlet, arriving with the main body, made a fateful assessment. This Russian army was not large. It was cornered on a hill behind a wooden wall. It could not run without being ridden down on the open steppe. All he had to do was break that wall, and the whole force trapped behind it would be his. So he committed his host to doing exactly that. Wave after wave went in. The horsemen charged the gulyay-gorod again and again, and again and again the guns cut them down. The wooden walls held. The Russians, fighting from cover with the discipline of men who knew that flight meant death, poured fire into every assault. The ground before the fortress filled with fallen men and horses, Still, Devlet sent them in, because the logic that had brought him here left him no easy way out. He had turned his back on Moscow to destroy this army, and now he had to destroy it or admit the whole campaign had failed. During this brutal phase of the fighting, the Russians struck a blow that shook the enemy command. In one of the clashes, they captured a senior leader of the horde, a powerful Nogais commander, one of the Khan's key lieutenants, remembered in the sources as Divi Musa. The loss of such a man was more than a personal blow. It disrupted the coordination of the assaults and rattled the confidence of the attackers. The captured lord was hauled inside the Russian lines, a living trophy and a sign that the impossible defense was actually working. But the Russians were not winning comfortably. Far from it. They were surrounded, cut off, and running out of the two things no fortress can fight without: food and water. The men behind the walls had been in the field for days, and the siege of their own moving fort was starving them where they stood. The horses grew weak, thirst set in. Vorotynsky's brilliant trap had caught the enemy, but it had also caught his own army, and the question was now brutally simple. Who would break first? For several days, the two armies were locked together in a grinding test of endurance around the hill at Molodi. From the outside, the horde pressed in. Devlet the first Giray had wrapped his forces around the Russian position, cutting it off from resupply and from any hope of easy retreat. Each day brought fresh assaults against the wooden walls, and each day the Russians paid to hold them. The defenders were bleeding men they could not replace. Their commander of the vanguard, the fierce Kvorostinin, was in the thick of it. The German gunners worked their weapons until the barrels fouled. The cannon spoke and spoke and spoke. But inside the walking fortress, a quieter enemy was winning. The Russian army had marched and fought and dug in without the luxury of a secure supply line, and now the stores were failing. Water was the crueler shortage. Men in armour, labouring in the summer heat, firing weapons and hauling the heavy shields into place cannot fight long without it. The chronicles remember the suffering of these days. Soldiers and horses tormented by thirst, the strength draining out of the defence hour by hour. Some accounts speak of men reduced to desperate measures simply to keep fighting. This is the part of Molodi that is easy to forget when you hear only the final tally of the battle. The Russians did not win because they were comfortable and the enemy was foolish. They won because they endured a situation that should have broken them. Every hour they held was an hour bought with hunger, thirst and exhaustion, against an enemy who still vastly outnumbered them, and who could taste the same victory Devlet had promised his followers back in that confident tent. And yet, and this is the crucial thing, the enemy was suffering too. Every failed charge against the gulyay-gorod cost the horde men and horses it would never get back. Every day the mighty invasion sat stalled before a wooden wall was a day it was not doing the thing it had come to do. Devlet had gathered this enormous host for a swift, crushing campaign. Burn Moscow, break the Tsar, carve up the land. Instead, he was bogged down in a siege on an open hillside, watching his warriors die in heaps before a fortress that would not fall. Frustration turned to something like desperation. The Khan's assaults had failed to crack the wall with cavalry alone. The horsemen, for all their courage, simply could not carry a fortified position from the saddle. So Devlet made a change that reveals just how determined and how trapped he had become. He ordered a large part of his force to dismount and attack on foot. This was a profound shift. The strength of the steppe army was its mobility, its ability to strike and vanish. By ordering his men off their horses to storm the walls as infantry, Devlet was throwing away the very thing that made his host so dangerous. He was trading his greatest advantage for the slim hope of overwhelming the fort by sheer weight of bodies, sending his warriors up the slope on foot, alongside the Ottoman janissaries, straight into the guns. It was the boldest possible bid to end the battle. It was also the opening Vorotynsky had been waiting for, because a horde committed to a frontal assault on foot is a horde looking in only one direction. Every eye, every weapon, every ounce of effort in that host was now pointed up the hill at the wooden wall. Their backs and their flanks were turned to the low ground, to the woods and folds of the land around Molodi, and in that low ground, hidden and silent, a Russian force was already moving into position for the blow that would decide everything. What happened next was, in its way, a masterpiece of timing, the kind of coordinated stroke that generals dream of and almost never achieve. The plan was as simple as it was deadly. While Devlet's dismounted warriors and the janissaries hurled themselves at the front of the gulyay-gorod, wholly absorbed in the desperate work of trying to storm it, Vorotynsky would take a picked force and move, unseen, around the enemy. Screened by the terrain, he would swing wide and come up behind the horde. At the signal, 2 hammers would fall at once. Vorotynsky would strike the enemy's rear, and the defenders inside the fortress would throw open their position and burst out into the enemy's front. The horde would be crushed between them. For the plan to work, everything had to happen in the same handful of minutes. If Vorotynsky struck too early, before the enemy was fully committed to the assault, the attackers could turn and face him. If the men in the fort sallied too soon, they would spend their strength before the trap closed. So the fortress held its fire and its fury while the assault raged against it, and the hidden regiment crept into place, and the whole battle balanced on a knife's edge. Then the moment came. At the height of the assault, with the enemy packed against the walls and straining to break in, Vorotynsky's force fell upon the rear of the horde like a landslide. In the same breath, the signal was given, and the defenders inside the walking fortress, the gunners, the arquebusiers, the German mercenaries, Forostinin and his men, flung open their line and charged out into the attackers' faces. Cannon fired at point-blank range into the mass of men crowded against the wall, and behind that mass, where no one had thought to look, a second Russian army was suddenly there, cutting into the exposed backs of the enemy. The effect was catastrophic and instant. An army in the middle of an all-out assault is at its most vulnerable, strung out, disordered, its formations dissolved into the chaos of the attack, its men focused entirely forward. To be struck hard from behind at that exact moment is to be broken not gradually, but all at once. The horde, so vast and so confident, came apart. Panic is a contagion, and on that hillside it spread faster than any commander could stop it. The dismounted warriors, caught between the guns in front and the swords behind, could not reform. Many could not even reach their horses. The Ottoman infantry, far from home and now trapped in a collapsing line, were caught in the ruin. What had been an assault became a slaughter, and then a stampede as the survivors abandoned the fight and ran. Devlet I Giray watched his invincible campaign disintegrate in the space of an afternoon. The host that had crossed the Oka in triumph, the army that had divided up the map of Russia before the fighting even began, was now a fleeing mob streaming south across the grassland, throwing away weapons and baggage to run faster. The Khan himself escaped, but the sources record that his losses cut into his own family, and that men of the highest rank in his host fell in the rout. The Great Invasion of 1572, meant to end the Tsardom of Russia forever, ended instead in blood and dust on a hill near Molodi. The wooden wall had held, the 20,000 had broken the horde, and a battle that history would almost forget had just decided the fate of a nation. The rout did not end at the edge of the battlefield. It ran all the way to the river and beyond. Devlet's shattered host fled south in disorder, and the Russians pursued. An army in flight is a fragile thing. It has thrown away its cohesion, its discipline, and often its will to fight. The steppe horsemen who had come north to conquer now had a single thought: to get back across the Oka and onto the open grassland where they might finally outrun their pursuers. In their haste, the sources tell us, the crossings turned deadly, and many who had survived the battle did not survive the escape. By the time the remnants of the Great Invasion straggled back toward Crimea, the host that Devlet had assembled with such care and confidence had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. The exact figures are lost to us, and the highest numbers in the chronicles should be treated with caution. Medieval and early modern sources routinely inflated the size of armies, both to magnify the threat and to magnify the victory. But even the most careful modern assessment agrees on the essential outcome. The invasion had not merely been repulsed, it had been annihilated as a fighting force. Devlet had come to take a country. He returned having lost an army. For Russia, the relief was immense, and the timing could hardly have been more critical. Remember the state the Tsardom had been in. The treasury was empty. The West was still at war. Plague and famine had gutted the population. Had the horde broken through and taken Moscow, there is a real argument that the young, overstretched Russian state might not have survived the century intact, or might have been forced back into the position of a tributary to the steppe, its hard-won expansion down the Volga reversed. Everything Ivan had built in his better years, the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan, the opening of the road to the Caspian, hung in the balance on that hillside. Molodi saved it. In a single, brutal, week-long confrontation, the southern threat that had loomed over Russia for generations was broken. Devlet I Giray abandoned his grand demands. There would be no return of Kazan and Astrakhan, no tribute, no submission. The taker of the throne had reached too far, and the reach had cost him everything. Strategically, the consequences rippled outward for decades. The Crimean Khanate remained a dangerous neighbour. The raids and the slave-taking did not stop overnight. But never again in this era would it feel the kind of host that could seriously threaten to conquer the Russian heartland and burn its capital. The catastrophic vulnerability of 1571, when Moscow had gone up in flames, was not repeated. The riverbank defences would be rebuilt and pushed further south in the years that followed, and Russia's long, slow expansion into the steppe, the process that would eventually turn the open frontier into settled land, was able to continue. It is one of the great ironies of this story that a victory so decisive should be so little known. Ask most people to name the battles that shaped Russia, and they will reach for later, more famous names. Molodi rarely appears. There was no grand monument raised on the field to fix it in memory, no towering legend built around it in the way other nations mythologize their great deliverances. The men who fought there saved their country, and then largely slipped out of the story. And no one slipped out more cruelly than the prince who had made the victory possible. For Mikhail Vorotynsky, the reward for saving Russia would not be honour. It would be the same shadow that had already fallen on so many others in Ivan's reign, and it would fall on him within the year. Here is where the story turns from triumph to something colder and far more human. Mikhail Vorotynsky had done what almost no one could have. Outnumbered several times over, commanding a patchwork army in a country that had spent a decade tearing itself apart, he had drawn the greatest steppe host of the age onto a hill of his choosing and destroyed it. He had saved Moscow. He had saved, arguably, the Tsardom itself. If ever a man had earned his ruler's gratitude, it was Vorotynsky in the autumn of 1572. Within roughly a year, that same ruler had him arrested. The charges belonged to the dark logic of Ivan's reign. Accusations of treason, of plotting against the Tsar, of dabbling in sorcery against his sovereign, in a court poisoned by years of terror, where suspicion was currency and no service was ever proof enough of loyalty. The very qualities that had made Vorotynsky a saviour, his high birth, his competence, his command of armies, made him a threat in the eyes of a Tsar who trusted no one. The man who had defeated a horde was accused of turning against the master he had just rescued. The sources tell us that Vorotynsky was subjected to the cruelty that had become routine in Ivan's system, and that he died soon after, on the road, as he was being taken into exile. The precise details are disputed, as such things often are, and we should be careful not to state as certain what the record only suggests. But the essential shape of it is not in doubt. The prince who won at Molodi did not die honoured in his bed, garlanded as the deliverer of his nation. He died a broken and condemned man, destroyed by the very Tsardom he had preserved. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the true heart of the story. The channel promised you a battle in which 20,000 men annihilated a horde many times their size, and that battle was real, and it was extraordinary. But the deeper truth of Molodi is not just about wooden walls and clever traps. It is about the strange, bitter relationship between power and the people who serve it. Vorotynsky is the hero who rots, the loyal man consumed by his own loyalty, the servant destroyed for the crime of being too capable in the service of a fearful king. And it forces an uncomfortable question about Ivan IV himself, the man history remembers as the terrible. In his early years, he was a reformer and a conqueror who expanded his realm and reorganized his state. In his later years, he became the architect of a terror that hollowed out his own kingdom and murdered his own defenders. Was he a builder or a destroyer? A strong ruler holding a fragile state together by fear, or the single greatest danger that state ever faced from within? The victory at Molodi belongs to his reign, but it was won almost in spite of him, by a man he would kill, in a country he had helped to cripple. Consider what these events truly weighed. A wooden fortress on wheels hauled onto a hill by desperate men. An enemy so confident he had divided the map before the battle. A young officer's reckless charge that turned the whole campaign. A hidden regiment, a perfectly timed blow, a horde broken between hammer and wall, and a saviour led away in chains by the ruler he saved. So here is the question we leave you with. When we remember the men who change history, we like to imagine they are rewarded, that the world in the end is just. But Molodi tells a different story. It suggests that the ones who save us are often the ones we destroy, and that the line between the hero and the traitor can be drawn by nothing more than a frightened king's imagination. Mikhail Vorotynsky saved a nation and was called a traitor for it. So what does that make him? The hero of Molodi, or its final forgotten victim? Tell us what you think in the comments, and ask yourself, before you go, how many other saviours has history quietly erased, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well?